Really warm welcome to you all and to our audience as well. Thank you for joining us on this final session. Now, I had planned a different discussion at the beginning, as you know, but because Minister Shimshek's presentation was so pertinent to this discussion, I'd like to pick up on what he had to say vis-a-vis the second incoming Trump administration. Now, Adam, you're head of economics at the Greater London Authority. London, in its own right, is considered quite a big economy compared to even many countries. Explain to us, how has your organization been preparing for the incoming Trump administration? Because we know Donald Trump has promised to introduce tariffs not only on imports from China, but also imports from Mexico and even Canada. And he says that he'll be enacting on that pledge on day one, so January 20th of 2025. So I'm interested to know, has that been a topic at all at the London Greater Authority, and how are you preparing?
Well, first things first, thank you, Mr. Moderator, fellow panelists and esteemed guests, and thank you, Your Excellency, for a great presentation. You're absolutely correct. For London, it's a very pressing concern, the fact that we could end up with a second Trump administration that could levy tariffs across the board. So we're not just talking about tariffs that are going to be imposed on China, but also on other countries around the world, especially when you consider that our economy is 90% services. It's a very services-based economy. The UK as a whole is a small open economy, so trade as a percentage of GDP in the UK is about 64%, according to the World Bank's data, which is a lot higher than many other developed countries. So the idea of tariffs that could impinge and impede our ability to export services as well as goods to the rest of the world is a tremendous concern. We, at the regional level, have an interesting take on building resilience because we happen to wield lower and less effective policy levers compared to national governments. So for us, the focus has been on trying to build resilience from the bottom up. We try to address some of the spatial inequalities that His Excellency mentioned, for example. Even within London, I always describe London as a tale of two cities. You have one reality of people obviously performing very well in the city of London, but you go to the suburbs and there is rampant poverty, rampant social exclusion. So if we try to address those spatial inequalities within the limited fiscal levers that we have, we're able to at least build a more inclusive society at the social level to try to at least use whatever is possible within our means to be able to withstand any kind of pressure emanating from the slower growth that potential tariffs are going to impose. And that brings me to the second strategy. It's interesting that I was having a meeting with members of the Chancellor of the Exchequer's Treasury team at the national level, and the idea is to try to overcome obstacles to growth by addressing the issue of fiscal centralization. So it's interesting that in the UK, 95% of total government revenue is generated by central government. That's a lot higher than the OECD average of 89%. So to try to find a way to generate consensus, to try to delegate more fiscal revenue generating powers to London would help us then wield more potential instruments that could help us grow and in a sustainable manner in order to withstand any of the effects of the Trump tariffs. Final point I'll say, obviously we don't know yet what's going to happen, whether this is just political rhetoric or whether he will in fact follow up on his promise, but I'm answering on the basis that we do in fact see those tariffs.
That's right, and if we know anything, is really we don't know what to expect from someone like President Donald Trump. Andrew Caruana-Galizia, as head of Europe and Eurasia for the World Economic Forum, I'm sure the incoming US administration has been a topic of discussion. We know Donald Trump in the past has been quite scathing of organizations like the World Economic Forum and other multilateral organizations as well, given that he really is advocating for an America First stance. But I'm wondering, how is the World Economic Forum anticipating what Donald Trump might do come January the 20th next year?
Thanks, Oscar, and thanks for having me. So I was prepared to answer a question about how countries could strengthen their own resilience, but now I get a question about how my own organization could strengthen its resilience to a Trump 2.0 presidency. An interesting fact is that Trump was the only sitting US president to come to our annual meeting twice. So even though there are people around him who are very critical of multilateral organizations, very critical of the very idea of an international community, President Trump himself actually saw a lot of value in making the trip to the mountain town of Davos. And the reason is because even the world's superpower needs to collaborate to meet its national interest. And to go back to tariffs, I mean, for me, so no one really knows what President Trump will do in his first week in office, but it's very clear that judging by his first presidency, he will impose tariffs. The real question is, will he do this as a negotiating strategy, or is it part of a sort of broader worldview where he would really like to see global trade reduce permanently to a low level? I subscribe to the first theory. My view is that President Trump likes to make deals. He'll impose heavy tariffs with an expectation of a change in position in the sort of targets of those tariffs. There are certain economies which are in an extremely weak position and unable to respond in a tit-for-tat way. Frankly, that is good for the global economy, because if all of the United States trading partners were to respond with retaliation, there would be devastating effects on the global economy. And the reality is that the United States will not be the first loser, will not be among the biggest losers. It will be everyone else who suffers. So really the most sensible advice I am hearing and seeing is that actually it's best not to retaliate, but offer something instead. And really, if I were sitting in a capital city, in a finance ministry, probably the first thing I would do would be to call Minister Shimsheka and ask him to send me his slide deck, because it provided a comprehensive strategy to build resilience. Yeah.
Now, Madam President, you have the quite unique experience of having dealt with Donald Trump while you were in office and while he was in office. You were president of Lithuania from 2009 to 2019, during which, of course, Donald Trump assumed the US presidency. I'm wondering if you could paint us a picture of what it was like to deal with Donald Trump, especially when he launched the trade war with China in 2018 and also threatened tariffs on the EU.
So what is very much clear that it will be not boring and interesting, because he likes to be predictably unpredictable. During the meeting with him in his office, I remember I named him that way, and he asked me to repeat this in press conference. Because for him, it's a tool of deterrence to be unpredictable. And he enjoys it, and he uses this tool. So all what he's now declaring, I call deterrence dance, because we do not know anybody, and even probably himself, what he will do. Directly to compare with the Trump first and Trump second probably will be not relevant, because this time he surrounding himself with more loyalists, that mean less professional and less arguing people, mainly people who will just fulfill his opinions. While in the first term, there was some discussions, some delays in his policies to be implemented. This time, I think delays will be none, but he himself is changing his opinions, depending on information. And if, for example, he can try to introduce, and he already declared that the first who will be hurt, it will be Mexico, Canada, and China, with different tariffs. Mexico already responded that they will not respond, will not go into this game. China, of course, said, no, 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 we will do more or less the same. But, and he could fast change his opinion if he will see that inflation is growing, prices are growing, especially inside the US. Because what will happen outside, I don't think he will care very much. What will happen in Europe or somewhere else. But if it will happen in US, it will be a problem for him, because his election was based anti-inflationary rhetoric. And if his actions will impose these kind of things. Of course, that's what is interesting with him, that he will impose fast, but he also can change fast. But if to base a little bit our knowledge on his first management style, the rhetoric is a lot harsher, a lot more aggressive than actions. Why? Because it's mainly about deterrence and to have the deal how he imagines good for US. It's not necessarily in reality it is good for US, but if it is possible to sell it to internal public and externally that this deal is good, that's enough for him. I'm basing my knowledge even on then in 2018, we were in the first meeting of him in NATO in Brussels, where he was threatening to withdraw, mainly because of defense spending too low in some countries, including in Europe. So, and it was enough for him to know that after his entrance in office, about 30 billion have been spent more because of his pressure. He took it as his win, and it was enough for him to stop at that moment from this decision, radical one. So why I'm again repeating, it will be interesting for us, for all of us, I mean, in all globally regions, in Turkey, in Europe, in other regions, we will need to learn to be flexible, fast, and creative, because he will be fast and creative. Every morning we will read again tweets, and we'll know what is coming. And we need to be prepared to react in one or another way. But it is possible to handle him, and it is possible to deal with him, because if we're talking about resilience generally and in our different regions, then he tries to say America first, and if we will say Europe first or Turkey first, so that means nobody will be the first. Who will be the first? There is no the first. If global trade and global relations deglobalize and crash, there will be nobody the first. So from this point of view, finally what I'm saying, political will and positive responsible leadership will matters. Because what to do, we know. Invest into R&D in that and that. But finally, it will be political will and positive leadership. Because today we do see destructive leadership mainly, destructive leadership. So it's about political will.
Vicky Pryce, you've been named as one of the world's top economists, many of whom agree that a second Trump administration is likely to be one of the world's major disruptors, economically speaking. What's your view? Do you believe in those scenarios whereby a lot of economists are predicting disruption, higher inflation in the shorter term if these tariffs do come to bear, and other supply chain issues as well? What's your opinion on that?
I think the first thing to bear in mind is that quite a lot of what has been announced by Trump he intends to do recently, such as the extra 25% tariff that he wants to impose on China, on Mexico, and on Canada, those are done for political reasons, in the sense that he wants to get concessions on migration from Mexico, for example, on whatever else he thinks about China, but particularly in terms of exporting things that you can make drugs with, which of course are affecting the US quite considerably. So we have a mix of things that he wants to do to support supposedly the UK economy, and things he wants to do where he wants to get the other countries to stop doing those things that he doesn't like them doing. Now, of course, you could argue that if you get a lot fewer people coming in through the borders with Mexico, the agricultural sector in the US would collapse, which is exactly what they're all saying right now, because in fact, it could be actually more of the labor which is working on land in the US is illegal right now, has no real legal status to be in the US. So if you start getting rid of all those, who's going to do those jobs? Which is the sort of thing, of course, which affects loads of countries which have issues with migration. Take those migrants away, and what do you do? Who's going to do those various jobs in the caring sector or anywhere else? So there is that element. but that if you disrupt, just as we were hearing in the presentation from His Excellency earlier, if you disrupt free trade with increased tariffs and non-tariff barriers, then obviously the economies generally suffer. So the expectation is that the tariffs, if they are indeed applied as they are, with retaliations from others, would result in the world growing even more slowly than what the forecasts are saying right now. And possibly, although it's not agreed among economists, whether you're going to have higher inflation overall or perhaps lower inflation because growth is going to be so much slower. We know that free trade is good for growth. We know that if you have barriers, then it's not. If you add to that the investment tightening that's taking place, and it's not just Trump. I mean, as far as I can see, Europe has become considerably more restrictive in terms of the types of investments it allows and wants to have scrutiny even at the central level of purchases that may be and M&A activities that may happen, which involve countries that they don't approve of or they're worried about in terms of strategic partnership that they may be there, and they would lose quite a lot out of having people they're not particularly certain about to come and acquire businesses which are strategic businesses. So there is a big move there. But the other thing to think about is that when we talk about restrictions, there's the whole Russian issue, what goes on there. But even Biden was pretty protectionist in everything he did with his IRA, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, where he was basically supporting and subsidizing local production and excluding quite a lot of others who were not producing and even not buying their stuff if they're producing them elsewhere. So you do have a tendency that's out there which, irrespective of whether it's Trump, the US is moving in that direction, has been moving in that direction for quite some time. So even if you're able to deal with Trump in the way that you're suggesting possibly, I think the US is in that path, and it does see itself as much more inward-looking right now and has been doing so for quite some time. And that is dangerous, not just from an economic viewpoint, but also, of course, defense viewpoint and many others. And that's climate change, for example, which Trump doesn't really believe in, or at least he does, but he says we shouldn't be doing anything that's very costly. So it is pretty worrying, and the world order, which is moving in that direction, is probably going to be pushed even further, and that's going to be bad news for the economy as a whole.
And Adam, of course, London and the UK more broadly has been dealing with a number of issues as well, including the ongoing ramifications of Brexit. We've also got the issue of a war in Europe between Ukraine and Russia that's still ongoing, as well as the war in Palestine as well. I'm wondering, in your view, what is the biggest geopolitical shock that the Greater London Authority is currently concerned with, or is it just basically an amalgam of all of the conflicts and other geopolitical risks?
It's a very good question, but before I answer it, I want to come to the Trump issue, because I was also working as the head of economic modeling for the government in Canada at a time when Trump 1.0 came about. And there was so much rhetoric about tariffs and about pulling out of NAFTA, which was the original agreement between the US, Canada, and Mexico. And in fact, it has been scrapped, and now there is a new agreement called the USMCA, US-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Now, what's interesting is that if you look at the substantive impacts of the new agreement, they're actually not that significantly different from what was in NAFTA. And so a lot of what the Trump administration tries to do is pretty similar to what the former president of Lithuania mentioned just on the panel. It's about making a deal that is framed in Trump's image, in his way of understanding the world, of wanting to show that he is basically in charge, that he is designing the trade agreements that suit his agenda, and especially try to perhaps distance himself from whatever has been done by his predecessors. So something just to bear in mind when it comes to the substantive effects. But to your question, it's a very good one. Obviously, in terms of global shocks, I would say all of the shocks that you just mentioned obviously have a bearing on London and the UK in general. But if I were to isolate which one had the most significant impact, at least on a regional level, I would have to say the war in Ukraine, which is a bit surprising because a lot of people might think it's Brexit. And here's why. I think that London at the moment, one of the key challenges that we face is rampant inequality. Housing affordability is a significant challenge in London. I don't know how many of you have visited London recently. You'd probably realize it's not exactly the cheapest place to live and to spend money in. And that, unfortunately, leads to lower productivity. In fact, we just produced a report in the GLA that shows that just a 1% improvement in affordability of housing can lead to an extra £7 billion in revenue. And that's just from 1% over a 10-year period. So the impacts are quite significant for an economy that is regional like London's. And what the war in Ukraine has done is obviously drive prices up. It has put significant pressures on cost of living. And as a result, what ended up happening is that those people I alluded to earlier who are socially excluded, who are relatively marginalized, they bore the disproportionate brunt of that pressure. They're the ones who have seen the cost of their housing, the cost of food, necessities, healthcare, providing childcare if needed, go up significantly relative to individuals who come from more affluent backgrounds. So I would say at the regional level, this is an issue that's often perhaps not mentioned, is the disproportionate effect and the spatial impacts of cost of living, not just within a country, but even within cities themselves. But having said that, obviously, Brexit has also had an impact, given that we are a relatively small, open economy, and I mentioned earlier that London tends to trade more so than other parts, even of the UK. But if you ask me to narrow down to one that I find significant, it's the war in Ukraine.
Andrew, can I ask you about the war in Ukraine? Because it very much falls into your remit at the World Economic Forum. We know that there has been an uptick in fighting at the moment, but we also know that there's uncertainty as to how Donald Trump may handle the conflict, given that he's been critical about the ongoing US monetary support for Ukraine. How is your organization dealing with this ongoing conflict in Ukraine between Russia?
Thanks, Oscar. So we're a global organization, we're impartial, but we are based in Europe. And so we felt the shock of Russian tanks rolling into Kiev as Europeans, so even non-European colleagues based in Geneva felt that shock of a land invasion on the European continent, just as we Europeans felt it. It was the first time in my generation, in my parents' generation, that we had such a large-scale land conflict on the European continent. And so our response, I would be lying if I didn't say that our response didn't factor that element of shock in. We were not prepared for something like that as an organization. We had not expected it. In many ways, it was an act of self-sabotage, and acts of self-sabotage are the hardest events to predict because they make no economic sense, in many ways no geopolitical sense. And so our response was immediately in support of Ukraine on the humanitarian front. Including raising money, helping to coordinate a humanitarian response through our partner companies who are in the logistics business, for example. And we also continue to contribute by doing what we do best, shining a light on what was happening in Ukraine, giving space for Ukraine's leadership at our annual meeting, giving them a global platform, trying to find pathways for them to engage in dialogue, not with the Kremlin, but with third countries who are maybe not necessarily helping. And so a couple of years have passed since then, and in many ways, what we feared the most is coming to pass, which is a world that is divided along the line that appeared at the moment of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So that line has deepened, it's grown wider. As Minister Shimshek mentioned, we're seeing nearshoring, friendshoring. This began with the pandemic, but Russia's invasion of Ukraine fueled it. So the old sort of driving forces of global trade, which were efficiency, comparative advantage, have now given over to resilience and security, which of course has a price. And the world is paying that price now. We've seen global growth decline from an average of 4.5% to 3%. We're seeing, the IMF predict a hit of 7% to the global economy if all the threatened tariffs are implemented. And this in many ways can be traced back to February 2022. It led to a loss of trust between the United States and China, which has since not recovered. There were obviously other factors driving that, but China's position on the wall has obviously deepened that rift. In Europe, there was almost a sense of betrayal when it came to third countries which decided not to support its efforts on Ukraine. And now Europe faces a situation where the United States might go that way, where the United States might actually change its position with regard to support for Ukraine, perhaps not with regard to Russia, but with regard to its financial and military support for Ukraine. And for me, that's one of these moments in the life of Europe, which will serve as a major test of European political will. I think it's clear to all of us that if the United States were to pull its support for Ukraine, Ukraine will not stop fighting, but it will struggle to maintain the current front line. Europe will be unable to fill that gap, not because it doesn't have money, not because it doesn't have strong enough armies, but in many ways because it lacks the political will in certain capitals to deploy that strength effectively. What I find most interesting about this moment is that it's very clear what the costless actions Europe can take now to improve its economic strength, therefore its security position, therefore its role in the global economy, so its geopolitical influence. And these are costless. What does that mean? It means not raising taxes, not taking on more debt. It means completing the capital markets union, for example. It means allowing for a proper banking union, allowing for a proper telecoms union. These will all help boost European growth. The only cost is political. There will be some member states which may lose. There will be some sort of vested interests which will be harmed. But there is actually no cost to taxpayers. And it's these costless measures which have the most impact, which cost the most politically, that require a crisis to implement. Hopefully, Trump 2.0 is a big enough crisis for that to happen. I'm semi-optimistic. There's a lot of opposition in certain European capitals to some of these measures. But I never believed that we would be talking about a capital markets union in Europe every single day. I would have never believed that it would be headline news, every other week, that heads of state and government would add it to the talking points. So we're getting close, and in many ways that makes me optimistic.
Madam President, as well as serving as the head of state for Lithuania, you also served as a European Commissioner a couple of times. How optimistic or pessimistic are you when it comes to the war in Ukraine? Because we know that conflict has tested the resilience of countries across Europe. Do you think there is still an appetite there to continue to support the administration in Kiev, or might some leaders in Europe follow Trump's view and say that enough is enough in terms of financially supporting the Ukrainian cause?
It's a more general question about the war in Europe. It's not about Ukraine. And it is the war not just European, it's already with elements of world war, because we do have Iranians and North Koreans participating directly, and even North Koreans on the ground of Ukraine. So it's not about Europe anymore, it's absolutely global war. And here we have no choice. It's not a la carte, you willing to help or not, participate or not, we are dragged in this conflict altogether. And the resilience of Ukraine and how much they will be able to resist with our support is our security also. So from this point of view, we see this exactly that way. It is about European security also. It's about global security also. And we have no choice. No matter what Trump will do, Europeans will be obliged to invest into our defense. And even in the European Commission, today we have new position, Defense Commissioner, Lithuanian, because we are on the border and we know what that means. And it's about also spending to defense. For Europe, we need to revive our defense industry, which is, some armies are a lot smaller than Turkish army. In some, I don't want to mention large countries, which are not spending even 2%, and they do not have armies, really. We smaller countries, we're already spending 3 and even close to 4% to our defense. And it is also very clear that after Trump's arrival, the defense spending, the floor of defense spending will be not 2% at all. Forget it. It will be 3-4% for some countries, but on the border with Russia, for example, or with the military tensions, it could be 5% or even more, and this will be no choice. That's what is coming, and from the point of resilience, it is a challenge, but it's not a bad challenge, because it will increase also our capacities and defense industry. Of course, it will be reshaping our economic model. In, for example, some countries, the old economic model based on cheap Russian fuel and energy, gone, and we will need to invest more into RNG and into alternative resources. Exactly, we got the Draghi report now talking about it. The first is investments into technologies and research. Second is cheaper energy and alternative resources. And the third block about security and defense already in this report. So it is clear the direction we will go, and we have no choice but to resist, to make our economies resilient, and to create absolutely different level of our defense. Putin will help us to do it.
Vicky Price, can I pose the last question of the session to you? Let's talk about the climate crisis and global heating. We know Minister Shimshek has identified it as one of the major issues that, frankly, some countries aren't grappling with at the moment. We know Turkey is building its resilience in terms of coping with the worsening effects of the climate crisis. How big of a geopolitical or economic risk do you think is climate change right now? And do you think countries are simply burying their heads in the sand, at least those who aren't really looking to address it properly in the longer term?
Well, we've just had a COP again, one of the meetings that happened to perhaps, partly see what various countries have done so far, but partly to reset, what needs to be done on climate change. And as we've seen, there's been quite a lot of money that has been set aside, or at least pledged. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to happen, a little bit like what discussed about Trump, which is about 250 billion a year being spent on supporting the global south, if you like, or those that are going to be more affected by climate change and are being affected much more immediately than the rest of us. But frankly, we've seen what's going on even in Europe with floods. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can attribute all this to climate change. There's some human stuff as well in terms of, did you build the right way? Did you have enough defenses, flood defenses, and so on? And one of the real issues is, this isn't just the cost that everyone is talking about, which I think Trump is talking about as well. Maybe we're trying to go into this green transition a bit too fast, and it costs too much for people, and they're all resisting it. But it's also what climate change does to one's property, one's livelihood. And it's interesting, I was looking at some statistics that showed, and there was floods, I think was mentioned in one of the slides before that the minister showed, that in the last 10 years where there were floods in loads of places, just to look at one aspect of climate change, costing huge amounts, by which we mean sort of billions. Only 14% of those disasters and the costs of those disasters were basically insured. So the government said to step in. So if you look at what's happening on the sort of fiscal front, where of course defense is in many ways needing to spend more, is making the whole fiscal side of loads of governments even worse right now when we're trying to have fiscal consolidation. Look what's going on in France at this moment where there is big political crisis because the deficit is so large. They're trying to cut back with tax increases, spending cuts and so on. You do need to spend, if you have those spending cuts, where is the money going to come from to do the spending that you absolutely need on climate change? And of course everyone says, well, it's going to be the private sector that's going to do this. We're just going to encourage it a bit by having regulation which leads you to that change of behavior. But firms are protesting. They're protesting about some of the regulations that say, you have to move to electric vehicles, in the next few years when there aren't enough charging points. Who's going to pay for that? How are you going to guarantee the take-up, and how are you going to guarantee the return to companies of investing in that way? And this is why you've already seen that there has been a little bit of a retreat from investment funds into this area. You've seen quite a lot of firms downgrading, and I have to confess, I have a sort of vested interest in this because I'm co-founder of a company called Good Corporation, which is looking at corporate social responsibility, ESG, and all that sort of stuff. But what you've seen is, basically greenwashing that's taken place quite considerably. So the private sector investment in this is an awful lot less than had been hoped for. But also, I'm afraid, in terms of cost to the individuals, what you end up with is the individuals footing a lot of the bill, and that's why there's been this resentment. That's why there's been this move to the right in so many countries. Because, of course, firms, particularly in the renewable energy side, want to be compensated for it. Because remember, the economics of it. Once you have your wind farm, your offshore wind farm or onshore, you've paid for the turbines somehow, or you then produce this electricity. The marginal cost of this extra electricity output is zero. So normally you price in a market to cover your marginal cost. If the marginal cost is zero, in order for you to invest, you have to have somebody guaranteeing this price. So the result is that actually renewable energy costs quite a lot. Nuclear costs quite a lot because, again, you have to guarantee it. The one thing that really doesn't, where in fact we've seen this huge investment because it does give you the returns actually quite cheap, is solar, which you can just expand it and get the return quite easily. And you've seen this big investment taking place. Batteries, again, you need somebody to invest quite heavily in this to have the impact that you want to be able to substitute for all the fossil fuel that you need otherwise. So we mustn't underestimate the investment cost, which governments are not prepared to do, B, the fact that businesses are just not going to do it unless you do this incentivization, and C, that at the end of the day, it's us who are going to pay for it. Are we prepared for it? It looks like not quite yet, and that's the real problem.
On that note, that does bring us to the end of our discussion. I'm sure we could talk for hours, but can we please thank our panelists, Adam Youssef, Andrew, Madam President, and Vicky Price. Thank you so much.